Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now in this one we're taking a look at this. Now I didn't intend to buy another GTX 1050 Ti, but it's been a while since we actually looked at the performance of one, and when I saw this one go up for sale on the Cashies website for £80, well, I just couldn't resist. And when I plugged it into my PC a couple of days ago, I couldn't believe how capable this thing still was. Sure, you have to reduce the settings in some games, and you might have to make certain sacrifices to either the render scale or native resolution, but considering this thing came out in 2016, it can actually still do a pretty decent job in modern titles, and I wanted to talk about that today. Now if you can find one of these, not necessarily this exact model, but any 1050 Ti for a reasonable price, then it may be worth picking up and slotting into an entry-level system or budget rig, because there are a few things right off the bat that I've always liked about it. The first is the lack of 6-pin PCIe power connector, so it's ideal for those systems that have more questionable power supplies, or just OEM systems that come with, well, questionable power supplies. The thing I like about these third-party or partner cards, I should say, is the different cooler designs. This Asus Expedition model is a great place to start. 2 fans, they switch off under low load. The card runs fairly cool, very quiet. And if you were going to pick up a 1050 Ti, well, you probably couldn't go wrong with one like this, but it all depends on the price of different models where you live. This one doesn't do anything different, actually, than a normal card, than any 1050 Ti. It's not the overclocked Expedition Edition. It's just the standard 1050 Ti with a different cooler, essentially, same clock speeds. Without further ado, let's get into it and see what this thing can do in 2022, because the results might surprise you. Let's start with Battlefield 5. This is the oldest of today's tested games, but I thought it made more sense to test this than 2042, as it still seems very popular. I don't know if you want me to use 2042 in the benchmarks instead. I mean, I still find it quite fun, but I know a lot of you probably prefer this one. I still have no trouble finding a game in 2022, so I think Battlefield 5 is still very relevant, and it's a game that will run perfectly fine with 1080p medium on the 1050 Ti. I've included the actual settings used at the start of each clip, so that you can go back and pause the video if you want to. Low settings might have given us a bit more headroom here, but I'd happily play at medium personally all day long, even if I do get wiped out about once every 3 seconds. In Cyberpunk, I would suggest going for the low settings. Now that includes low crowd density, low textures, and the low preset. I would also recommend selecting FSR, which in this case is set to balanced. I think the inclusion of options like this, as well as things like dynamic scaling and resolution scaling, have really been a big help to older entry-level graphics cards. The 1050 Ti, for example, is not always going to be able to cope with 60 or even 30 FPS in newer games, but modern in-game and driver features like NVIDIA image scaling as well, for example, will get this card out of some sticky situations. I prefer native res or FSR where possible, but it's nice to know that there are certain settings available to utilise, and Cyberpunk 2077's addition of FSR as of update 1.5 really benefits this GPU. Elden Ring doesn't have a dynamic res option or FSR support, but as I mentioned before, we could use NVIDIA image scaling if we wanted. Now that said, I stuck with native 1080p today, and I think despite this, we still got a playable experience in return. It's important to manage your expectations with a 1050 Ti in 2022. I mean, it was never a GPU intended for consistent 60 FPS gaming, at least not outside of esports games, but in the grand scheme of things, it holds its own fairly well, and it does a better job than I thought it would have. We've tested this card before, not this exact model, and it is one of my favourite cards of all time. With the 750 Ti being unable to run certain games due to lack of DX12 support, this has sort of taken its spot in terms of a recommendable low-cost Ti card. It's still putting up one hell of a fight. Far Cry 6 is best suited to low or medium with the 1050 Ti, and I went with medium, but I also enabled the quality FSR mode. FSR works quite well here, it looks pretty good, and it meant that during my Far Cry 6 gameplay benchmark, we were able to average almost 60 FPS. Not quite, but a lower FSR option or a couple of tweaked settings would see to this. Still, the occasional dip below 60 is still going to be unavoidable, as with most games tested today, but by no means is it a complete stutterfest here or with any other tested game. Another solid result for one of 2016's most popular graphics cards. At least I assume it was. I mean, it still holds third place on the Steam hardware survey at the time of this video. In Fortnite, I went with the medium preset once again, but I extended the view distance to far and set the anti-aliasing quality to TAA just to smooth out some of those jagged edges around the different in-game environments. This isn't a necessary adjustment, it's just a personal preference. In terms of performance then, I have no issues to report aside from the usual and occasional FPS dips. These weren't too significant and didn't hinder my performance. Fortnite is always more demanding than I think. Every time I test it, I find it difficult to gauge how it's going to run before I actually run it. That said, I do think the visuals carry their own kind of unique charm, and the more I play it, the sort of more I've been getting into it. Sometimes I can't be bothered with a complex story or adventure, so I just want to blast some enemy players. Nice to know I can do so on the 1050 Ti in 2022. I'm starting to sound like a broken record now, but in Forza, it was the medium preset once again. I changed nothing else from the in-game menu. I simply selected medium and made sure my res scaling options were off. This is Horizon 5 at native 1080p, and I've got to say it runs very nicely on the 1050 Ti with the occasional but expected dip below 60. Different races and areas of the map will perform differently. The same can be said for any game really, but for the most part, if you buy a 1050 Ti to play Forza, you're going to have a solid experience, even with 4 gigs of VRAM. I've sort of been overlooking that, actually. 4 gigs of VRAM doesn't sound like much these days, but it's what I'd consider the minimum, to be honest. I'd suggest avoiding 2 gig cards, but I wouldn't necessarily rule out the 3 gig 1060 either, as that has proven itself on the channel over the years. God of War now features FSR 2.0, which does a better job at maintaining image quality over FSR 1.0. I tested it in Deathloop not long ago, and it seems to work well here as well. With the 1050 Ti, I stuck with the original settings, which I can only presume look similar to how the game does on the base PS4. I did turn atmospherics down and ambient occlusion off, as they seem to be two of the more demanding options. God of War ran fine with this graphics card, all while the fans stayed relatively quiet. I do like this Expedition edition, it looks great and performs well, just as well as any other card with the stock clocks. Now I'm not sure how many models of 1050 Ti have 6-pin connectors, this one of course doesn't, but if you have an OEM system or weaker power supply, I'd suggest looking for cards like this without the need for any additional power, as to me this is part of what the 1050 Ti is all about. I recently added San Andreas Definitive Edition back into my benchmark list because it has, along with the other games in the trilogy, seen some performance improvements. I've noticed that it's a lot more solid in terms of performance overall, and if you've been holding out since the initial reception, I think it's worth picking up now, though I do still prefer to play the original on my PlayStation 2. Maybe watch some other performance videos, ones that compare day one performance to how the trilogy runs today. That said, if you've got a 1050 Ti and want to play the graphically enhanced versions of 3 Vice City and San Andreas, you should be able to do so now just fine. I chose the low preset here because I assumed the worst going into it, but I definitely could have bumped a few things up, that's for sure. Halo Infinite has a cool minimum frame rate option that lets us choose a target. For example, I went with the low settings at 1080p, but I also selected 60 FPS as a minimum frame rate, meaning that the game will dynamically adjust the resolution to try and maintain 60 FPS. It did a pretty good job, and overall we averaged more than 60. The game didn't look too blurry with this option enabled, but it is easy to tell that we weren't always running at native. It's not off-putting by any means, and I was still able to enjoy the game. It's been a while since I played this actually, but it's still very fun, a perfect game for killing a few hours on a Sunday evening. To finalise, I played Red Dead Redemption 2 using the Xbox One X equivalent settings. With that said, I dropped the resolution scale to 80% for a higher average frame rate because native meant a lot more dips below 30, even though the average sits between 30 and 40. I'd suggest either dropping a few of the graphical options, maybe textures, though anything other than ultra textures do look noticeably worse. Lowering the resolution scale is preferable to me, but it's obviously not what everyone would choose to do, and playing about with different graphical options is always advisable. Overall, the 1050 Ti, well, it's still pretty impressive, or at least it's surprising in what it can do in 2022. I didn't expect it to be able to achieve some of the results that it hit today, but it's no doubt helped along by the implementation of things like FSR and dynamic res scaling in certain games, and I think going forward, features like that are certainly going to continue helping it out. If you enjoyed this one, leave a like down below, leave a dislike if you didn't. Thank you very much for watching. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and hopefully I'll see all of you in the next one.